My daughter's baby shower was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. That's how I remember it, a house full of soft laughter, pastel ribbons, and the scent of vanilla frosting. I was standing by the window, holding a cup of coffee I'd brewed too strong, watching the light fall across the faces of people I'd known since she was a child. I am Evelyn, 68 years old, retired teacher, mother of 2, widow of a quiet man named Thomas, who taught me how to fix a fence and keep my word. My daughter Clara had always been my pride, gentle, clever, with a touch of stubbornness that reminded me of her father. Her husband, David, was polite, though distant in a way that never quite settled in my heart. Still, I told myself love had many shapes. That afternoon, Clara stood by the table, laughing as her friends unwrapped gifts, tiny socks, a silver rattle, a blanket with embroidered clouds. The room felt warm, full of women's chatter, the kind that wraps around you like an old shawl. I was setting another tray of cupcakes when David approached me. He looked pale, a nervous kind of pale, as if the walls were closing in on him. He leaned close, pretending to help me with the tray, and whispered so quietly I thought I misheard. "That child isn't mine. It's your son's." For a heartbeat, I didn't move. The sound of laughter blurred into a dull hum. I could hear the ceiling fan ticking like a clock in a courtroom. My fingers trembled, and one of the cupcakes slid from the tray, landing softly on the carpet. I turned to him, my voice low. "What did you say?" He looked at me, eyes red, almost wet. "Ask her. Ask Clara," he said, and then stepped back, as if afraid of what might come next. For the rest of the afternoon, I stood among the guests, smiling when they smiled, nodding when they spoke, though I couldn't hear a word. My heart was a drum in my chest. Every time Clara's hand rested on her round belly, I felt a sting I couldn't name. Later, after everyone left, I walked into the kitchen and began washing the dishes. The water was warm, the soap smelled of lemon. Clara came up behind me, humming a tune she used to sing as a girl when she wanted to hide her nerves. "Mom, did you have fun?" I wanted to ask her, "Is it true?" But the words clung to my throat like wet clothes. I looked at her reflection in the window instead. She looked happy, glowing in that way new mothers do. I thought of my son, Michael, who hadn't come home in months. A wild, restless boy who never stayed in one place long enough for roots. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my late husband's armchair, staring at the mantel where our family photograph stood, the 4 of us on a windy beach, Clara clutching her brother's arm, both laughing at something their father had said. How could such laughter turn into this silence? I told myself David must have been mistaken, jealous, maybe even cruel. But in my bones, something heavy began to stir the quiet, knowing that mothers have. The next morning, I found a folded piece of paper slipped under my door. It was David's handwriting. Just one line. "You deserve to know the truth before she lies again." My hands shook as I read it. Outside, the sea wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere in the house, the old clock struck 7, steady, unforgiving. I set the paper down beside my coffee, and for the first time in years, I whispered my husband's name. "Thomas, what am I supposed to do?" The cup trembled in my hand. Because deep down, I already knew the answer wasn't in asking Clara. It was in finding the truth quietly, the way one listens for the sea in a shell patient, alone, certain that what's hidden always finds its way to the surface. But there was something she didn't know. When I think back to the years before everything fell apart, I see sunlight, the kind that lingers on the curtains long after morning has passed, the smell of fried eggs and buttered toast, the scrape of Thomas's chair on the kitchen floor, and laughter, always laughter. We lived in a small white house on the edge of the sea. Not rich, but comfortable. Thomas built the porch himself, plank by plank, humming old country tunes. I would hand him nails and iced tea, pretending not to notice how his hair turned silver each summer. Clara was born first, a quiet baby with thoughtful eyes. 2 years later came Michael, loud and curious, forever running towards something invisible. They grew up chasing seagulls on the beach, their footprints weaving together and apart in the wet sand. I used to watch them from the porch, their voices rising against the tide. Sometimes I'd call out, "Don't go too far," and they'd wave without looking back. In those days, my life was simple. I taught part-time at the local school, and every afternoon I'd return home to the smell of sawdust from Thomas's workshop. He made furniture tables, cribs, picture frames, things that held the weight of love. When Clara was 6, he built her a dollhouse painted pale blue, with tiny curtains I sewed from old handkerchiefs. "Daddy," she said once, tracing a finger over the wooden roof, "will I live in a house like this when I'm big?" Thomas smiled. "Maybe you'll build one yourself." Michael laughed. "I'll build one for her." He meant it too. Even as a child, he was protective, the kind of brother who'd share his dessert without being asked, who'd stand up for her when the neighborhood boys teased. They were close, closer than most siblings. Sometimes too close, I thought, but I never said that aloud. As they grew older, the differences between them deepened. Clara was careful, deliberate, a planner. Michael impulsive, full of restless energy. Yet, they understood each other in ways even I couldn't reach. When Thomas died suddenly a heart attack one gray morning while mending the gate, it was Michael who held his sister while she wept. I remember that day vividly. The sky had no color. The sea was loud and cruel. In the hospital corridor, I sat between them, my hands on their knees whispering, "We'll be all right," but I think I said it more to myself than to them. After the funeral, the house felt too big. The porch creaked differently without Thomas's boots. Clara took on the quiet duties, paying bills, cooking, helping me with schoolwork. Michael withdrew, staying out late, talking less. One night, I found him sitting in the truck, staring at the steering wheel. "Where are you going?" I asked. "Nowhere," he said. "Just need to drive." He was 17. I could see Thomas's stubborn jaw in him, that same hunger for something beyond this town. I didn't stop him. Sometimes love means letting them wander. Years passed. Clara graduated, got a job at the clinic, met David. He was polite, accountant type, clean shoes, soft voice. I approved, though I worried about her rushing into marriage. "He's steady," she said. "I need steady." When Michael came home for her wedding, he was different, leaner, quieter, a shadow of the boy he'd been. Yet when they hugged, I saw something flicker between them. Not romance, no, I never would have thought that. Just something unspoken, a shared history that ran deeper than words. That night, after the guests had gone, I found them on the porch, talking softly. "Promise me you'll visit," she said. "If you promise you'll write," he answered. "Always. Always," he repeated. I closed the door quietly, not wanting to disturb that moment. I thought it was sweet. I thought they were just siblings saying goodbye. In the years that followed, letters from Michael came less often. A few postcards from faraway places, construction sites, small towns, places with no return address. Clara built her life. A house, a husband, a hope for children. And then, slowly, whispers began. David calling more than once to ask if I'd heard from Michael. Clara avoiding my eyes when his name came up. I told myself it was nothing. Siblings drift apart. People change. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear Clara in the old nursery sitting in the rocking chair, clutching the photograph of her father and brother. The moonlight would spill across her face, and she'd whisper something I couldn't quite catch. Once, I stepped closer to listen. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to." I stood there in the doorway, heart tightening. I told myself it was just grief, just a memory. But part of me, the part that had watched my children grow side by side, their hearts twined by something fierce and secret, felt a chill I couldn't name. Because love, when left unguarded, can take strange shapes. And sometimes, what we bury under the sand has a way of washing ashore. 3 days after the baby shower, the air in the house turned heavy, the kind of silence that hums in your bones. I'd spent most of the morning staring at David's note on the kitchen counter. The words had started to blur, as if the paper itself was tired of holding them. "You deserve to know the truth before she lies again." It was Sunday. The gulls outside screamed over the tide, and the kettle hissed softly, a small, faithful sound. I poured myself coffee, but the taste had turned bitter. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, to breathe, to think. I was a teacher once. I believed in order, in proof. But proof doesn't come knocking sometimes. It waits quietly in places you forget to look. That afternoon, I decided to clean. It's what women of my generation do when the world feels too loud. We wipe, polish, fold. I began in Clara's old room. The walls still had faint outlines of posters she'd torn down years ago. A cracked photograph frame sat on the desk, her and Michael, both smiling, both sunburnt from that summer at the lake. I traced their faces with my thumb and felt something deep inside shift. In the bottom drawer, beneath old letters and a tangle of ribbons, I found a small brown envelope. No name, just a faded stamp from a town 2 hours north Redmarsh. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Michael's. For a long moment, I just stared. Then I opened it. Inside was a folded photograph and a single sheet of paper. The photo showed Clara standing in front of a motel, wearing a summer dress I'd never seen. Her hand was resting on the doorframe, and her eyes were looking at whoever took the picture with an expression I couldn't name. On the paper, a note in Michael's handwriting. "You said it would be the last time. I believed you. Don't call me again. M." The words hit like a wave, not loud, but endless. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the envelope trembling in my hand. My first thought was denial. It must have meant something else, maybe an argument, a misunderstanding. But my mind began stitching pieces together. I didn't want to see the long calls Clara never explained. The year Michael stopped coming home, the way she cried alone in the nursery before she told anyone she was expecting. The truth doesn't shout, it waits. I put the photo back in the envelope, sealed it, and tucked it into my cardigan pocket. That evening, I took a walk to the cliffs. The sea was rough, spitting foam against the rocks. Thomas used to say, "The ocean tells the truth in waves." I thought of that now, as the wind tangled my hair and the horizon swallowed the last light. I didn't cry. I couldn't. There's a kind of grief that sits too deep for tears. When I returned home, Clara was waiting at the kitchen table, her hands around a cup of tea gone cold. "You went out?" she asked. I nodded. "Just a walk." "You look pale, Mom. Are you okay?" I sat across from her, the envelope pressed against my heart like a secret I wasn't ready to speak. "I'm fine," I said. She smiled faintly. "You shouldn't worry so much." I wanted to tell her that mothers don't stop worrying, not even when their children lie to them, but instead, I reached for her hand. It was warm, soft, trembling just slightly. "Clara," I began, "are you happy?" Her eyes flickered, just for a second. "Of course," she said. "David and we're fine." The lie hung in the air like perfume, sweet but choking. That night, I placed the envelope in my jewelry box under the string of pearls Thomas had given me on our 15th anniversary. I locked it and slipped the key into my pocket. Then I sat in bed, thinking about what to do. I could confront her, demand the truth, bring it all to light, but something inside me whispered to wait. The truth is a living thing. Sometimes, it's wiser to let it walk to you on its own. So I waited. And while I waited, I began to plan quietly, methodically, because if my daughter's life was built on lies, I needed to know who she'd become when the lies were gone. And I knew deep down that the key I held wasn't just for the jewelry box, it was for everything that was about to unfold. For the next few weeks, I moved like a ghost through my own house, smiling, cooking, answering calls, keeping my voice steady, while beneath it all, my mind was building something, not revenge. Not yet even truth, just structure, the scaffolding of understanding. I woke early each morning, as I always did. Coffee, window light, the sound of waves rolling in from the cliffs. Clara would call once or twice a week, her tone bright, practiced. "The doctor says everything's fine, Mom," she'd say. "I'm glad," I'd answer. But between her words, I could hear the tiny hesitations, the small pauses where guilt hides. I started keeping a notebook, nothing dramatic, just dates, times, phone calls, little details. Teachers learned to observe quietly. Years in the classroom had trained me for this kind of patience. Then, one morning, I took the bus into town. I hadn't done that in years. The driver recognized me. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," and I smiled, grateful for the anonymity of routine. I stepped off in front of the Redmarsh Municipal Building, the same name stamped on Michael's old envelope. Inside, the air smelled of paper and dust. The clerk behind the counter looked no older than 30. I explained I was updating family records, trying to locate property details in my late husband's name. He pointed me toward an older woman named Margaret, who wore glasses and smelled faintly of lavender soap. Margaret was kind and curious in that small-town way. "Thomas Hale," she repeated, typing. Yes, yes, property on Bayview Road, deed transferred 5 years ago to, oh. She hesitated. To Michael Hale, and later co-signed by Clara Hale. Both appear on record. I felt the floor tilt slightly under me. When was that? I asked. She adjusted her glasses. 4 years ago, ma'am. Looks like a secondary mortgage was taken out, small business loan, paid off last year. I thanked her and left, my pulse quiet but fast. 4 years ago, around the same time, Clara had told me she and David were struggling financially. I had offered to help, but she'd refused. We'll manage, she'd said. David got a promotion. A lie again. On my way home, I stopped by the bank. The manager, Mr. Dalton, had been my student long ago, a kind man with a receding hairline and an old-fashioned respect for privacy. Mrs. Hale, he said warmly. It's been ages. I leaned closer. I just need to check something. Quietly. He glanced around, then nodded. Of course. When he pulled up my family accounts, his expression changed slightly. It seems your daughter made a withdrawal using a joint authorization from your son 2 years ago. But, he looked puzzled, the signature on your son's copy doesn't match his file. He didn't say forged. He didn't need to. I thanked him again, heart heavy with the weight of clarity. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my garden, the hydrangeas blooming, the air thick with salt. I thought of how easy it is to lose sight of your children's shadows once they grow taller than you. When I reached the porch, the mail was waiting. Among the bills and leaflets was a letter-thick paper, no return address. Inside was a photograph, Clara and Michael, sitting outside a small seaside motel, hands almost touching, eyes locked in something far beyond sibling warmth. On the back, a date. Just 1 year before Clara's wedding. I took the photo inside, laid it beside the one from the envelope. Together, they told a story no mother wants to read. That night, I made a decision. I would not confront her. Not yet. I would watch. I would understand. I would prepare. I began to withdraw small amounts from my savings, enough to be unnoticed, but steady. I transferred them into a quiet account under my maiden name, Evelyn Cross. I hadn't used that name in decades. It felt foreign, yet strong. Every secret needs a safe place to breathe. When Clara called again, her voice was sweet. Mom, can you come by next weekend? David's been acting strange. I think he's jealous of something ridiculous. I almost laughed. I'm sure he's just tired, dear. But inside, something sharper was forming, not anger, but purpose. I started visiting the lawyer's office once a week, under the pretense of updating my will. Mr. Keene, my late husband's old friend, listened carefully as I asked about property transfers, trust accounts, guardianship laws. Are you expecting trouble, Evelyn? He asked once. I smiled faintly. I'm expecting truth, Mr. Keene, and I like to be prepared when it arrives. He nodded, quietly respectful. When I left the office that day, the sun was lowering orange light spilling across the bay. I passed a shop window and caught my reflection, the same woman, same lines, but something new in her eyes. Steady, awake. I was still the mother, still the teacher. But I was also the quiet witness now to the lives they had built, to the lies that bound them. And if there's one thing I'd learned in 6 decades, it's that those who think they can deceive a mother forget what a mother remembers. Clara believed I was still the same, gentle, trusting, old-fashioned. She had no idea I was already moving the pieces beneath her feet. She thought I was the woman she could still fool. She thought wrong. It was late autumn when Clara came back. The sea had turned rough, the sky a gray that looked almost bruised. I remember I was in the garden, trimming dead hydrangea blooms, when I heard a car door slam. When I turned, she was standing at the gate, hair unbrushed, eyes swollen, one hand resting on the curve of her belly. Mom, she said softly. Can I come in? Her voice was small, almost childlike, the way it used to sound when she'd scraped her knee and wanted me to make the pain disappear. But this wound was deeper, invisible. I nodded. Of course, Clara. She stepped inside, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and a purse clutched tight to her chest. There was something hollow in the way she moved, slow, careful, like a woman walking through the ashes of her own life. Inside, the kettle was already on. Some habits are older than heartbreak. I poured her tea, the kind she used to like jasmine with honey, and waited. David left, she said finally. He said he couldn't do this anymore. Her hands trembled as she lifted the cup. Did he tell you why? I asked, though I already knew. He said, he knows about Michael. The words hung between us, heavy and sharp. She didn't look up. Her thumb traced the rim of the cup over and over. He found some letters, old ones. I thought I'd burned them. And were they true? I asked quietly. Clara looked at me then, eyes wet, frightened, tired. I don't know what truth is anymore. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clock in the hallway ticked, the same rhythm Thomas used to hum when sanding wood. You can stay here as long as you need, I said. She nodded, the relief visible in her shoulders. Thank you, Mom, I don't have anyone else. And there it was, the irony of it all. The woman who had lied to me, used my trust, forged my son's name, was now back under my roof, seeking shelter. That night, I made up the guest room. I placed fresh sheets on the bed and set a glass of water by the nightstand. On the dresser sat the jewelry box closed, locked, the key warm against my own chest. As I stood in the doorway watching her sleep, she looked peaceful, almost innocent. But memory is cruel. It doesn't let innocence stay unbroken. I remembered her as a child, sneaking cookies before dinner, her giggle echoing down the hall. I remembered her teenage years, the slammed doors, the tears, the apologies that never quite reached her eyes. And then I remembered the photograph, the motel door, the way her hand had lingered against the frame. The next morning I made breakfast. Toast, eggs, black coffee for me, milky for her. She came to the table in my old cardigan. Do you think he'll forgive me? She asked. David? She nodded. I didn't mean to hurt him, Mom. I got lost. And Michael? I asked. Her face went still. Don't, she whispered. But I didn't press. Not yet. Over the next days, she moved around the house like a ghost, cooking small meals, cleaning, folding laundry. Sometimes I'd catch her staring out the window toward the cliffs, her hand resting on her belly. He'll come back, she said one evening, when he calms down. I stirred the soup slowly. Maybe. He loves me, Mom. I looked at her, and for the first time, I felt something unexpected pity. Not the soft pity of sympathy, but the deep, aching kind that comes when you see someone trapped in the web they spun themselves. That night she came to my room. Her face was pale, eyes red. Mom, I didn't mean for any of it to happen, she whispered. I know, I said. Things like this rarely start with meaning to. She cried quietly, her head against my shoulder, like she used to when she was little. And though my heart ached for her, I kept my hand still. Love, after all, is not the same as rescue. Later, when she finally fell asleep, I went to the kitchen. I opened my notebook, the one where I kept my quiet records, and I wrote, She thinks she has found refuge. But this is where her lesson will begin. Outside, the wind carried the sea's breath through the open window. The house creaked softly, like it was listening. And in the small hours of the night, as moonlight stretched across the floor, I realized that forgiveness, true forgiveness, would take time. It would need truth first. And truth, I had learned, does not come when called. It waits for silence. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. If rhythm can exist in the ruins of something broken, morning light, coffee, the creak of the front door as Clara stepped out to fetch the mail, hoping for a letter that would never come. The house had begun to feel smaller, as though it were holding its breath around us. I could hear her pacing at night. Sometimes she would stop outside my room, stand there for a moment, and move on. One morning, I found her sitting on the porch steps, the sea mist clinging to her hair. She was staring out at the horizon, her hands cupped around a chipped mug. No word from David? I asked. She shook her head. He changed his number. His office says he's taken leave. I sat beside her, the boards creaking beneath our weight. Have you thought about what you'll do? There's not much I can do, she said quietly. He handled everything, the bills, the accounts. I don't even know what's left. I said nothing, because I already knew. The following week, the bank notice arrived, a polite but unmistakable letter. The mortgage on her house had defaulted, payments missed, penalties due. The polite print bled quiet panic. She stood at the counter reading it, her lip trembling. He stopped paying, she murmured. He really left me with nothing. I reached for the kettle. Tea? Mom, she snapped suddenly. This isn't about tea. The cup rattled against the counter, but I kept my voice steady. Everything's about tea, Clara. You'll see that when you're calmer. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes burning with something: shame, anger, exhaustion. Then she sighed, defeated. I'm sorry. I don't know how to live like this. That evening, she began selling things online: jewelry, furniture, her wedding dress. I watched her photograph each item carefully, as if saying goodbye to pieces of herself. Maybe I can get work, she said one night. Something small. Maybe the clinic will take me back. You could, I said, but perhaps start simpler, one step at a time. A week later, she came home from town wearing a uniform from a small bakery near the harbor. Flour dusted her sleeves, and for the first time in months, her cheeks carried color. It's only part-time, she said, but they needed help with mornings. It feels good to be busy. I smiled. Honest work always does. She smiled back, faint, uncertain but real. At night, when she returned home, she would sit at the kitchen table, counting coins into a jar, humming under her breath. I saw the beginnings of something fragile returning: humility, perhaps even peace. But life has a way of testing those who try to mend. One afternoon, a car pulled up outside. I recognized it instantly: David's silver sedan. Clara froze when she saw it through the window. Don't, I said softly. Let him come to you. He didn't knock right away, just stood by the gate, staring at the house. When he finally did step onto the porch, his expression was hollow, sunken. Clara, he said when she opened the door, we need to talk. She hesitated, then stepped aside. I stayed in the kitchen, close enough to hear, far enough to give them the illusion of privacy. You told me you'd ended it with him, David said. You swore the child was mine. I thought. Don't, he interrupted. You thought I'd never find out. That's what you thought. The silence that followed was long and heavy. You'll be served papers soon, he said finally. I won't fight for anything that isn't mine. And then he left. Clara stood in the doorway long after the sound of his engine faded. When she turned toward me, her face was pale, blank. He's gone, she whispered. For good this time. I walked to her, placed my hand on her shoulder. Then it's time to stop looking back. That night, she didn't cry. She sat by the window, watching the tide climb higher, her fingers tracing circles on the glass. A week later, she started selling the last of her jewelry, including a gold bracelet I'd given her on her wedding day. When she handed it to me for polishing before listing it, I saw her hands shake. Are you sure? I asked. It's just metal, Mom. It doesn't mean anything anymore. But I knew that wasn't true. I watched her work, sleep, wake, the days blurring together, her belly growing, her steps slowing. Each night I wrote in my notebook, she is learning now, not through punishment but through living, through loss. Sometimes I'd see her reading on the porch, her hand resting over her heart, the wind teasing her hair. There was a stillness in her now that hadn't existed before, the kind that comes only after the storm has broken everything that once mattered. I didn't forgive her yet, not fully. But I could see the cracks that truth had made, and through them, the faintest light of understanding. The old house groaned softly in the night, like it approved. The winter passed slowly that year, one soft rain at a time. The air carried salt, and the faint hum of distant waves, like the sea itself was whispering reminders that everything, even pain, eventually ebbs. Clara still rose early every morning, walking to the bakery before dawn. I'd hear her shoes against the gravel, the sound fading into the fog. When she returned, her apron smelled of yeast and cinnamon. Her face, once pale and anxious, had begun to soften. Sometimes she'd leave a small loaf by my door. For you? She'd say. You don't have to. I know, but it feels nice to give. It was such a simple thing, but it meant the world. Life began to hum again, quietly. I found myself spending afternoons in the garden, pruning roses and watching the street beyond our gate. The neighbors would pass, some offering polite smiles, others pretending not to notice. The rumors had done their rounds long ago, but time makes even gossip tired. One morning, I met a man named Harold. He was nearly 70, retired from the docks, and lived 2 houses down. He carried a small brown dog that trembled like a heartbeat in his arms. She's blind, he said, noticing my gaze. But she still knows the way home. He smiled, and somehow that sentence stayed with me long after he walked away. That evening, as I sipped my coffee, I wrote it in my notebook. Even the blind find their way when love leads them. Clara began talking to Harold too, on her way to work. Sometimes she'd stop by his gate, leaving him a pastry. He would thank her with that gentle sailor's grin. She seemed lighter around him, not in romance, but in peace, the kind of peace born from being seen without judgment. At the bakery, she grew close to a woman named Lila, a widow who'd lost her husband to the sea years ago. Lila was laughter in an apron, with eyes that had learned how to turn pain into kindness. One afternoon I walked down to visit them. The shop smelled of sugar and rain, and Clara was at the counter rolling dough beside Lila. "So, you're the mother," Lila said, smiling. "Clara talks about you. All good things, I hope." "She's learning," Lila said softly. "Aren't we all?" The warmth in that place felt holy, not because it was grand, but because it was earned. Every loaf, every crumb, was an act of forgiveness in motion. When we walked home that day, Clara said, "Lila's been through worse than me. But she doesn't carry bitterness. She said it poisons your sleep." "She's right," I replied. "Bitterness feeds on the one who holds it, not the one who caused it." She nodded quietly, her hand brushing the curve of her stomach. "Sometimes I still hear his voice," she said. "David, in my head, telling me I ruined everything." "Then answer him back," I said. "Tell him you're rebuilding something better." Weeks passed. The baby grew. So did Clara's steadiness. I'd watch her knitting tiny clothes by the window, her face peaceful in the lamplight. Sometimes she'd hum old songs from her childhood, and I'd pretend not to listen, though my heart did. Then, one evening, Harold stopped by with his little dog. He had a letter in his hand. "For you, Evelyn," he said. "They're forming a neighborhood volunteer group, food drives, shelter repairs. Thought you might like to help." I almost refused. My knees weren't what they used to be, and my solitude had become a comfortable excuse. But something in me stirred a memory of the woman I once was, before secrets turned my house into a fortress. So I joined. The first meeting was in the old town hall, the air thick with dust and laughter. People brought casseroles, flowers, stories. Strangers who'd lived within a mile of me for 20 years, and yet we'd never shared a single word. There was a widower who repaired bikes for the children, a young mother who made soup every Sunday for anyone who needed it, and a teenager who painted old fences to make the street smile again. I listened to them, quietly at first. But then I found myself speaking too about resilience, about motherhood, about losing and learning, and for the first time in years, my voice didn't tremble when I said my name. Clara came with me once. She stood near the doorway, shy but curious. When the young mother offered her a bowl of soup, she hesitated, then took it. The warmth in her hands brought tears to her eyes. Later that night, as we walked home, she said, "I didn't think people could be this kind anymore." "They can," I said. "You just have to stop hiding long enough to see them." She smiled, her eyes glistening in the streetlight. "I think I'm learning that." That night, after she went to bed, I sat on the porch with a blanket and listened to the quiet hum of the sea. The house no longer felt heavy. It breathed again. The tide had turned not in one great wave, but in 1,000 small acts of humanity. Peace is a delicate thing. It doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives quietly like a bird landing on a windowsill, and just as quietly, it can fly away. The weeks after Clara's 7th month were calm. The bakery thrived, the neighbors smiled more often, and the evenings were filled with the scent of salt and bread. I'd begun to think that perhaps the worst was finally behind us. Then, one afternoon, a thick white envelope arrived in the mail. It was addressed to Mrs. Clara Emerson, her married name, but the sender's mark chilled me. It came from Rivers and Lowell, attorneys at law. I set it on the table, the air around it suddenly heavy. Clara came home half an hour later, cheeks flushed from the walk, humming softly. "There's mail for you," I said, nodding toward the envelope. Her smile faltered the moment she saw it. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. The color drained from her face. "He's contesting custody," she whispered. "David, he's saying I'm unfit to raise the baby." I felt my breath catch. "On what grounds?" "On moral grounds. He says the child isn't his, that I'm unstable, that I've been living," she swallowed hard, "off charity." The paper fluttered from her hands, landing face down on the table. The words hung in the air like ash. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the storm clouds gather over the sea. Lightning split the horizon, silent but fierce. The world felt too big again, like the safety we'd built was just a trick of the light. In the morning, I made a decision. I dressed in my old Navy coat, the one I used to wear to the courthouse when my husband and I handled our small business affairs, and told Clara, "We're going to see a lawyer." She nodded weakly. "But I don't have anything, Mom. Not money, not proof." "You have the truth," I said, "and me. That's enough to begin." The office of Mr. Keller, an old friend of my late husband's, smelled of old books and strong coffee. He greeted me warmly, his eyes kind but sharp. After reading the letter, he leaned back in his chair. "It's an intimidation tactic," he said. "He's not after the baby, he's after your peace." "But can he win?" Clara asked. Keller adjusted his glasses. "Not if we prepare properly, but Evelyn." He looked at me. "Your daughter's accounts are empty. Her records show irregularities, closed investments, missing funds. If David's lawyers dig deeper, they might find things you both thought were forgotten." I met his gaze steadily. "There's more you should know." For the next hour, I explained carefully, truthfully, the arrangements I had made after my husband's death, the trust in my name, the properties under Clara's, the quiet shifting of assets that I had done long before she knew, not deceitfully, but defensively, out of fear that one day, the family she married into would take everything. Keller listened in silence, his pen scratching softly. When I finished, he smiled faintly. "You were smart, Evelyn. Smarter than most." "No," I said, "just a woman who learned early that security is invisible until it's gone." We spent the rest of the morning gathering what we could: old deeds, bank statements, photographs, even handwritten notes from David. Every piece of paper carried a memory. Every signature was a ghost. That evening, back home, Clara sat at the table going through documents. Her fingers traced her father's handwriting on an old letter. "I forgot how careful he was," she whispered. "He believed in preparation," I said. "Not for fear, but for peace of mind." She nodded. "I wish I'd listened to him more." "You're listening now," I replied. A few days later, the first hearing was scheduled. I could see the fear creeping back into her, the quiet dread of being judged, of being stripped of what little dignity she'd rebuilt. The night before the hearing, I brewed her chamomile tea. She sat across from me, pale and silent. "Mom," she said suddenly, "what if they take my baby? What if I deserve this?" I reached across the table, held her hand. "No one deserves cruelty, and no one can take a child from a mother who has learned to love through her mistakes." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I wish I could be like you." "You're already better," I said, "because you're still learning." The next morning we drove to the courthouse. The old truck's engine coughed to life, and the road stretched before us like a quiet reckoning. Rain tapped gently on the windshield. As we passed the harbor, Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver key, the one I'd given her when she first moved out years ago. "I never returned it," she said softly. "It was never mine to take back," I answered. She held it tight in her palm, as though it anchored her. When we arrived, David was already there, sharp suit, tired eyes, arrogance barely hiding his guilt. His lawyer whispered something to him, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. I saw a flicker, not hatred, not even anger, but the recognition that the woman before him was no longer the one he'd manipulated. The proceedings were brief that day. Keller's calm voice filled the room, laying out facts like stepping stones across a dark river. By the time we left, the storm outside had cleared. The air smelled of wet asphalt and sea salt. Clara looked up at the sky, tears in her eyes, but something new in her posture: resolve. "He won't stop," she said quietly. "Then we'll stand taller," I replied. "Truth may take its time, but it never loses its way." As we drove home, the setting sun broke through the cloud streaks of gold over the dark sea. For the first time in a long while, I felt no fear, only certainty. The crack had appeared, yes, but sometimes a crack isn't the end of something. It's where the light gets in. The following week felt like living inside a breath you couldn't release. Every day, a new letter, a new call, a new shadow cast over our fragile peace. Keller worked tirelessly. He came by the house often, now briefcase in hand, spectacles perched low, smelling faintly of tobacco and rain. His voice, calm and measured, became our anchor in the storm. One gray afternoon, he arrived with a folder thicker than any before. He didn't sit right away, just stood there, looking at me with that expression people wear when they bring news that will change everything. "Evelyn," he said, "I need you to see something." He opened the folder and spread out several documents across the kitchen table, photocopies, signatures, printed emails. I leaned forward. "What am I looking at?" "David's filings," Keller said. "He claimed financial hardship, said he supported your daughter for years. But look here." He tapped one sheet. "Bank transfers, offshore accounts, dates that overlap with the months he said he was unemployed." Clara's breath caught. "He lied?" "More than that," Keller continued. "He used your name, Evelyn, your late husband's estate account. There are forged signatures here nearly identical but not quite. See this E in your name? He never knew it loops upward, not down." I stared at the page. My own handwriting, but not mine. A tremor ran through me. "He used my husband's account," I said quietly. "The one we closed after the sale of the store." Keller nodded. "He must have found an old statement. The bank confirmed he reopened a sub-account under your family trust 3 years ago." Clara covered her mouth. 3 years ago, that was when we bought the second car. He said his father lent him the money." The room fell silent. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, a small domestic sound in the middle of something enormous. "What happens now?" I asked. "We take this to the court," Keller said. "If we present this proof, the entire foundation of his case collapses. The custody claim, the financial accusations, all of it. But Evelyn," he paused, "this means exposing him publicly. The press could take an interest." I nodded slowly. "Truth deserves daylight, even if it stings the eyes." Clara reached for my hand. "Mom, you don't have to do this. It'll drag up everything. Dad's business, your health, all the years you worked to stay quiet." I looked at her, truly looked. Her face, softened by motherhood. Her eyes, no longer sharp with arrogance but bright with worry. "Clara," I said gently, "there comes a time when silence becomes a lie. I won't live in that kind of quiet anymore." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my desk, the house dark except for the faint glow of the lamp. I opened my notebook, the one where I'd written through the long nights after my husband died, and added a single line. "The truth doesn't destroy families. Secrets do." The hearing was set for Friday. The morning came dressed in fog. I wore a dark blue coat, the same one from years before the one my husband once said made me look brave, even when I wasn't. When we entered the courthouse, David was already there, his lawyer beside him, his confidence still polished but thinner now, like paint cracking beneath too much weather. Keller carried the folder close to his chest. When the judge called the case, he stepped forward and spoke with the precision of a craftsman. He laid out every document, every forged transfer, every signature that didn't belong to me. And then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Your Honor, the funds in question were never Clara Emerson's. They were misappropriated from her late father's estate under false pretense and without consent. The defendant, Mr. David Emerson, forged these documents." The courtroom murmured. David's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering into his ear. Clara sat rigid beside me, hands trembling. "That's not true," David said suddenly, standing up. "She's framing me, her and her mother. They're doing this to—" "Sit down, Mr. Emerson," the judge interrupted, his tone cutting through the air like steel. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Keller presented the final piece, a notarized letter from the bank, confirming the forged reopening of the trust. It was over before I even realized it. The judge adjourned briefly, then returned with a short statement. "Given the presented evidence, all claims by Mr. Emerson are dismissed. The court will recommend investigation into potential financial fraud." David's face turned the color of wet ash. His hands gripped the table. Clara began to cry quietly, uncontrollably, and I reached for her hand beneath the table. "It's done," I whispered. "It's truly done." Outside, the air was sharp and clean. The courthouse steps gleamed with rain, and the gulls circled overhead. Clara stopped halfway down and looked at me. "You saved me, Mom." "No," I said softly. "I just held the light steady while you found your way." That evening, we sat by the window again, sharing the quiet. She brewed us both tea, adding a bit too much honey the way she used to as a child. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now?" I said, smiling faintly. "Now comes the hard part, learning to live without enemies." The sea outside was calm, and the last light of the day slid across the horizon like forgiveness itself. The war was over, not won by power or pride, but by truth, spoken softly, at last. The morning after the hearing, the sea was gentle, a sheet of silver stretching to the horizon. For the first time in many months, I heard birds again. It's funny how peace has a sound once you stop holding your breath. Clara slept late that day. She had cried herself empty the night before, not with shame this time, but with release, the kind of tears that wash the last of the fear away. When she finally came downstairs, the house smelled of coffee and lemon polish. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the morning light spilling over the papers still stacked from the trial. "You're up early," she said softly. "Old habits," I replied. "Sleep runs from me sometimes." She poured herself a cup and sat across from me. Her eyes were swollen but calm. "I can't believe it's really over," she murmured. "It feels like waking from a long nightmare." I looked at her, my daughter, grown yet fragile, humbled yet strong. "It's over because you faced it," I said. "And you didn't run this time." She nodded slowly, then her eyes fell to the pile of documents between us. She reached for one. These papers, the trust, the properties, the old accounts, they were all still in your name, weren't they? "Yes," I said quietly. "So all this time when I thought you had nothing, when I saw you living so simply," she looked up, her voice trembling, "you weren't poor." I met her gaze. "No, Clara, I wasn't." The silence that followed was thick with understanding. The clock ticked softly, marking each beat of revelation. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered finally. "All those years, I thought you depended on me. I pitied you." "I know," I said gently. "That's why I let you." She stared at me, speechless. "Your father and I built this home brick by brick," I continued. "He believed that money isn't love, it's a tool. When he passed, I saw how people change around money, how pride hides behind generosity, and I wanted to know who you'd be without it." Her voice broke. "And what did you find?" I looked at her, tears gathering in my eyes but not falling. "I found that you were lost, but I also found that you could find your way back." Clara leaned back in her chair, pressing her hands against her face. "You let me fall so far, Mom. You watched me lose everything." "Yes," I said softly, "because sometimes losing is the only way to understand what you never truly had." She lowered her hands, her voice small. "You wanted me to learn." "No," I said. "I wanted you to see." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The kettle clicked off, and the faint cry of gulls came through the open window. "Finally," she said, "I used to think strength meant having control, money, a marriage, the right friends. Now I see it's something else entirely." "It's grace," I said, "and it's rarer than gold." She smiled faintly through her tears. "You always speak like you're in a book." I laughed softly. Maybe I just lived long enough to see the chapters unfold. Later that afternoon, Keller stopped by with final paperwork, the court's confirmation that all claims were dismissed. He congratulated us, shook Clara's hand, and said, "Your mother is quite a woman." After he left, Clara turned to me, a strange mix of awe and guilt on her face. "You knew everything, didn't you? The lies, the bank accounts, the fake signatures you knew before Keller even told us." I hesitated, then nodded. "I suspected. Your father taught me to keep one eye on the quiet corners of truth." "And you didn't say anything?" "Because you weren't ready to listen." She sat down again, her shoulders sinking, the weight of realization pressing into her. Then she looked up, tears brimming. "You saved me twice," she said. "Once by staying silent, and once by speaking up." I reached across the table, placed my hand over hers. "No, darling, I only loved you the best way I knew how." That evening, after dinner, Clara walked into the living room carrying a small box. She sat beside me on the old sofa and opened it. Inside was the gold bracelet she had tried to sell months ago. "I couldn't let it go," she said. "It reminded me of you, stubborn and unbreakable." She slipped it onto my wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. "Do you forgive me?" she asked quietly. I looked at her. the woman who had once been my careless child, and smiled. There's nothing left to forgive, only lessons to remember. Outside, the sea shimmered beneath the fading light. The house, once heavy with secrets, felt open again. I could hear laughter from the street, the hum of evening life returning. Clara rested her head on my shoulder. "You were right," she whispered. "Truth takes its time, but it never loses its way." I kissed the top of her head. "And it always finds its home." The tide was coming in, slow and certain. In its rhythm, I heard something I hadn't in years: peace. Not the fragile kind, but the lasting kind, that only truth can bring. Spring arrived quietly, the way forgiveness does, without fanfare, just sunlight and new leaves where everything once seemed dead. The air smelled of wet soil and blooming jasmine. The house, once a place of mourning and mistrust, had softened. Even the walls seemed to breathe easier. Clara had begun to laugh again. It was a fragile laugh, at first cautious, like someone testing the strength of a bridge before stepping fully onto it. But in time, it grew. I'd hear her humming in the kitchen, talking to her unborn child as though every word was a promise. One morning, I woke to the sound of her voice calling from the garden. "Mom, come look at this!" I slipped on my cardigan and stepped outside. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands muddy, her face glowing. In the flower bed near the porch, a single white lily had bloomed. "I didn't plant that," she said, amazed. I smiled. "Your father did. Years ago. It must have slept all this time, waiting for the right season." Clara touched the petals gently. "It's beautiful." "So are you," I said. "You just needed your own season." She looked up at me, her eyes soft but clear. "I think I'm finally ready to start again." And she did. A month later, the bakery offered her a full-time position. She accepted, and Lila, her friend with the laugh like bells, taught her the business side of things. Soon, she was managing the shop, waking before dawn and returning home with flour in her hair and a tired, satisfied smile. "It feels good to work for something honest," she told me one evening as we shared tea on the porch, "even if it's small." "Small things built with integrity," I said, "tend to last the longest." Around that time, the volunteer group Harold had introduced me to began restoring an old community center by the docks. They asked if I'd help organize meals for the workers. I hesitated. I hadn't worked in years, but Harold just smiled. "We could use your calm voice," he said. "Some of these young folks only know how to shout." So I went. And in that old, echoing hall with its peeling paint and salt-stained windows, I found purpose again. I baked. I listened. I told stories. Sometimes, when someone was hurting, I'd share a small truth from my notebook. "You can't rush healing," I'd say. "It moves at the pace of trust." They'd nod, not always understanding, but always softening. Clara joined me once, carrying a tray of pastries. The others welcomed her warmly, not as a fallen woman, but as one of their own. She worked beside me that day, handing out bread, her smile steady and real. At one point, a young mother approached her and said, "I heard what you went through. I'm going through something too, not the same, but close. How did you survive it?" Clara looked down for a moment, then answered, "By not confusing pain with punishment. Sometimes life breaks you so you can fit into a better shape." The woman hugged her, crying quietly. And I, watching from the other side of the room, I felt something deep inside me shift, a quiet joy, a pride without words. By early summer, Clara had given birth. A boy healthy, strong, with a shock of dark hair and a cry that filled every empty corner of the house. When she placed him in my arms for the first time, my hands trembled. "He's perfect," I whispered. "I named him Daniel," she said softly, "after Dad." I couldn't speak for a while. The tears came, warm and unstoppable. The child blinked up at me, his tiny fingers curling around mine as if to anchor me to the present. Life had come full circle through grief, betrayal, silence, truth, all the way back to love. Not the naive kind, but the seasoned kind, shaped by endurance. Clara was a mother now, and though the past still lived in her eyes, it no longer ruled her. She carried it the way a tree carries its rings, not as wounds, but as proof. In the evenings, I would sit by the window with baby Daniel sleeping in my arms, the soft hum of the sea beyond the glass. Clara would hum while cleaning up the kitchen, her voice blending with the sound of the waves. Sometimes I'd think of my husband, of the way he'd smile when the world felt heavy. I'd imagine him standing at the garden gate, nodding quietly, proud of what had endured. The house that once held secrets now held laughter. The same walls that echoed with silence now carried the soft music of new life. One night, Clara said, "I've been thinking, maybe we can start a little community program at the bakery. Hire women who need a second chance the way Lila helped me." I looked at her, smiling. "That's a beautiful idea." "It's what you taught me, Mom," she said. "Kindness is the only inheritance worth leaving." I reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. "Then you'll leave the world rich." That night, I wrote in my notebook, "There is no greater rebirth than seeing your child become the woman you once hoped to be." Outside, the white lily swayed softly in the moonlight, its petals reflecting silver. The sea whispered below, steady and eternal. We were all still learning, still mending. But for the first time, our story no longer hurt to tell. It had become something else, something whole. The sea is calm tonight. The kind of calm that comes after a storm that's already told all its stories. From my porch, I can see the horizon melting into pale gold. Daniel is sleeping inside, his soft breathing steady as the tide. Clara is at the bakery, closing up for the evening. I told her to rest tomorrow, but she just laughed and said, "Rest is sweeter after work." The house feels different now, not larger, not newer, just alive. The windows are open, and the curtains dance with the wind. There's a faint smell of cinnamon and salt in the air, the scent of our shared life, humble, imperfect, but honest. Sometimes I sit here and think of how everything began: the baby shower, the whisper that tore my world apart, how fragile truth can be, and yet how necessary. For a long time, I thought forgiveness meant weakness, that to forgive was to excuse what had broken you. But I learned it's the opposite. Forgiveness is choosing to let the wound close, not for the one who hurt you, but for yourself. Harold still visits sometimes. He brings me small things, jars of honey, new seeds for the garden, stories from the town. We talk more like old friends now than anything else. And that's enough. Companionship doesn't always need to bloom into romance. Sometimes it's the quiet presence that heals the most. Last week, I found my husband's old photograph in the drawer by the bed, the one of him standing by his truck, wind in his hair, squinting against the sun. I held it for a long time. For years, I thought he'd be disappointed in the choices I made, but now I think he'd be proud not of the outcome, but of the endurance. I still keep his wedding band in the little cup by the window. Some nights, I place it in my palm, feeling its cool circle against my skin. It reminds me that love doesn't end, it just changes shape. When people ask how I found peace after everything, I tell them this: you don't find peace, you grow it little by little, like a garden no one else can see. The key that once locked away my pain now hangs on the wall by the front door. It's a simple brass key, worn smooth by years of holding on. I keep it there not as a symbol of what was locked, but of what was finally opened. The other day, Clara came to sit beside me on the porch. Daniel was toddling across the floor, chasing a sunbeam. "Mom," she said softly, "do you ever wish things had gone differently?" I thought about that for a long moment before answering. "No," I said. "If they had, we wouldn't have learned what truth feels like." She smiled, and in her smile I saw both the girl she used to be and the woman she'd become, strong, weathered, radiant. We sat together in silence, listening to the waves. The sea has a language all its own. Some evenings it hums, others it sighs. Tonight it feels like it's breathing with us, a rhythm of acceptance. I looked out at the horizon and whispered, more to myself than to her, "True wealth isn't what you keep, it's what you can still give, even after losing everything." Clara reached over and took my hand. "Then you're the richest woman I know." The sun dipped below the edge of the water, leaving behind a line of soft pink light. The world seemed to exhale. In that moment, everything was enough: the chair beneath me, the smell of coffee cooling beside my hand, the sound of laughter inside the house. Life had not gone as I planned, but it had gone exactly as it needed to. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush my face, whispering its quiet benediction. Somewhere, I thought, my husband was smiling. Somewhere, the universe had kept its promise that even in brokenness, beauty finds a way to return. And that is how I've come to understand peace, not as silence, but as harmony between what was, what is, and what will be. So tonight, as the stars appear over the sea, I whisper one last thought into the dusk. True wealth is dignity and love. The rest is just noise. The waves answer softly, their rhythm matching my heartbeat. The porch light flickers on, and the story, my story, finally rests. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Leave a comment, let's meet in the comments. If you liked this story, you can support me by sending a super thanks, so I can keep bringing more stories like this one. Thank you for your sweet support. See you in the next life story.